Well, to my mind, one of the deepest thinkers of the West, that's a short list, is certainly Fyodor Dostoevsky. And today I want to talk about one of the masterpieces of actually a philosophy in literature, and that's Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. I should say a word or two about Dostoevsky. He's a man of enormous genius. Many writers would count themselves fortunate if they had maybe one great work in a lifetime. Um, Dostoevsky had two, at least, and certainly his followers would probably cite very many more. Um, he's best known for his um, major opus, The Brothers Karamazov, just a beautifully written, powerful book. And one of the chapters of The Brothers, as it's known, is a famous chapter called The Grand Inquisitor, which is a classic not only of philosophy and literature, but also of religious thought and even theology to a certain extent. His other major work is Anna Karenina, which, again, literature scholars, point to it as one of the great works of Western art. Um, what draws me to Dostoevsky, though, is this short little work he wrote that really introduced me to existentialist thinking, and that's entitled The Notes from Underground. And I think one of the reasons why Dostoevsky is such a deep thinker and such an important thinker is because he was one of the first, maybe one of only two thinkers, the other being St. Augustine, who looked so deeply into the human psyche that they saw the full measure of human complexity. And they weren't quite certain that they were ready to pronounce the human being to be a rational creature. So Dostoevsky, to a certain extent, is our uh, modern introduction to the irrational side of the human condition. His book famously begins with, I should say a few other things about Dostoevsky as a person. He suffered from a form of epilepsy, and these were fairly serious, though I guess they would call them grand mal seizures, and they were observed by people who visited him. Freud was a major fan of Dostoevsky and did a major study of Dostoevsky's seizures. Again, from his perspective, it was a significant fact that Dostoevsky's seizures began after his father died. It's worth mentioning also that throughout Western thought, dating back to the ancient Greeks, there was a notion that epileptic fits or seizures were a kind of divine touch. Readers of Plato will note, of course, that Socrates himself would often go vacant. I guess they would call this partial seizure during the course of one of his dialogues, one of his discussions. So there is that aspect of Dostoevsky's life. Is that an element in why he was such a deep thinker? I think one would have to unpack several dozen volumes of Carl Jung, really, in order to get into that question. So the book opens with the underground man pronouncing that he is a sick man. And what does his sickness consist in? Well, the most important word, and you could use a couple of different stand-in words, but the most philosophically trenchant one is the idea of resentment. The underground man has various physical maladies, but really what constitutes the essence of his alienation is in fact his resentment. And he's resentful towards everything and everyone around him. He has various physical ailments, you see, but he won't go to the doctor because that would give the doctor the satisfaction of being right. And what the underground man is really enthralled by, even in his misery, is the idea that he is free to say no, to reject, to be negative. His negativity in his mind gives him a certain mastery over the human condition, not unlike the mastery that Sisyphus accomplishes in Camus' short work. So this resentment, though, is difficult to really get a hand on for us. And I think part of the difficulty is that we keep thinking that if we just analyze an individual enough, we'll be able to figure it out, figure out why it is that this person is spiteful or uncooperative. There must be some psychological reason at the heart of this. And it's, to a certain extent, this is the kind of the bias of our age. We tend to have almost a behavioral filter to our view of the world, and Dostoevsky will have none of it. He believes that we're rejecting the plan, whatever the plan happens to be, purely for the sake of rejection, negativity, purely for the purpose of rejection. In the social sciences, we're completely baffled about why generation after generation, in country after country, people will consistently vote against their own self-interest, be it economic, political, just to exercise a kind of irony or rejection or negativity or spite. And so, and certainly politicians, leaders of all centuries have known that resentment is a very powerful human motivator. And oftentimes no amount of money, no amount of income, no amount of self-interest, empirical self-interest, will dislodge the power of resentment. And this is something that Dostoevsky clearly, just digs into in Notes from the Underground. Now, a couple of things that he focuses on here. He's admitting that his resentment is completely illogical. And this goes against the grain, as I said, of our empirical or utilitarian outlook, but it's also radically anti-Enlightenment. So I don't think you can place Dostoevsky in the Enlightenment tradition. He had just such a visceral reaction, at least in the pages of Notes from Underground. The symbol, the empirical correlate for his resentment is this mammoth structure from the 1850s that was built in London called the Crystal Palace. Now, Crystal Palace is not that important in and of itself, but what it typifies is this kind of can-do engineering spirit that informed a lot of Enlightenment thought, this kind of naive belief in the power of science to bring us better, faster, more accomplished, and a kind of false hope in the future. And Dostoevsky says, no, I'm putting the brakes on this. This is not the case. History is not a perpetual advance. Civilization has actually made us worse, and made us more destructive of one another, precisely because it raises our expectations and it forces us to continuously repress the irrational within us, and to think that there's a formula in any way, shape, or form that will get us out of this. And so the Crystal Palace for Dostoevsky really epitomizes this misplaced faith in technology and in the future. He also is exhibiting in the book a tremendous suspicion and disgust towards what's normal, and the various authority figures who pronounce when and under what conditions something is normal. And for Dostoevsky, these categories are just foolish. There's nothing normal about the human condition. There's nothing rational about the human condition. We can, interact with other people. But even there, because we have this mind of ours, we can perpetually re-examine our motives, and it becomes kind of like an onion. There's never any there. So, so the power of resentment and the category of resentment, as I said, I think this is Dostoevsky's major contribution in this book. And I think if we reflect on the irrational that we come into contact with, it might be useful to just suspend our categorizing of our experience, our attempt to explain everything away with a phrase or some kind of meme or something, and just experience it and recognize that the irrational is here. People will act just for the sake of acting, just because using one's ability to say no is a kind of rush. It leaves one with a sense of power in a world that is often defined by powerlessness. So there you have it. Dostoevsky, I think, one of the deepest thinkers of the West, and one thinker who really put his finger on something I think actually defines the human condition in the new century.